The Devil. Next door, Virginia McCallow's House of Horrors. In the quiet town of Great Bateau, Essex County, behind the walls of an ordinary house lived a daughter who seemed like a blessing to her aging parents. Virginia McCallow appeared to be the perfect caretaker, devoted, attentive, and always there. But beneath this mask of kindness lurked something far more sinister. This is the shocking story of how a seemingly dedicated daughter transformed her family home into a tomb, living alongside her terrible secret for 4 long years while fooling everyone around her. What drives someone to murder their own parents? How did she manage to keep her dark secret hidden for so long? And what finally led to the discovery of her horrifying crimes? Join us as we uncover the disturbing truth behind one of Britain's most chilling cases of elder abuse and murder. If real stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Each like helps us bring more of these important stories to light, and by sharing, you help others understand how darkness can hide in plain sight. Ring that notification bell to never miss a new video. The devil can wear many masks. In the quiet town of Great Bateau, Essex County, she wore the face of Virginia McCallow, a woman who existed in fragments through the eyes of others. To her aging parents, she was their saving grace, an angel of mercy destined to care for them in their twilight years. Her siblings saw through different eyes, whispering tales of a pathological liar who spun webs of deceit. The neighbors merely smiled and shook their heads at the eccentric local oddball who roamed their streets, pressing unwanted gifts into reluctant hands and occasionally sporting a prosthetic pregnancy belly, a peculiar theater of one. But behind the walls of an unremarkable house on an unremarkable street, a horror story was quietly unfolding. Virginia was the youngest of 5 children, born in 1988 to John and Lois McCallow, a respected university professor and his homemaker wife. John's expertise in autism spectrum disorders filled bookshelves with his published works, while Lois filled their home with the sharp scent of disinfectant and the echoes of unspoken emotions. Theirs was a household governed by rules, where feelings were seen as flaws and discipline was the highest virtue. The McCallow marriage itself was a study in emotional distance, separate bedrooms, parallel lives united only by their rigid adherence to old-world parenting philosophies. Lois's world was increasingly circumscribed by her conditions: obsessive-compulsive disorder that turned cleaning into a ritual, agoraphobia that made the outside world a battlefield, and anxiety that she medicated into submission. Her children grew up under the weight of her compulsions, learning to navigate a home where hand-washing was sacred and emotional expression was sacrilege. As Virginia grew older, she became a chameleon of sorts, adapting her personality to match others' expectations. To some, she was the aspiring artist with dreams of greatness. To others, she was the neighborhood curiosity who hadn't worked a day in her 30 years. But no one questioned too deeply why her aging parents hadn't been seen for months. No one imagined that behind Virginia's array of masks lurked something far more sinister, a monster wearing the face of a dutiful daughter. The truth, when it finally emerged, would shatter the quiet illusions of their small town forever. Fear has a way of shaping a home. For Lois McCallow, it manifested in downcast eyes and hurried steps, her gaze perpetually fixed on her feet as she scurried along neighborhood streets, dodging human connection like raindrops. John, battling his advancing glaucoma, became equally elusive, a man who existed in glimpses between his front door and car, treating social interaction as an unnecessary delay in his precisely ordered world. Their house became a fortress of isolation, not just for themselves, but for their children. The walls that kept the world out also kept secrets in, punctuated by Lois's screams that eventually drew the attention of Child Protective Services. Among the darkest of these secrets was their approach to discipline, where a child's bedwetting became grounds for harsh punishment, and order was maintained through fear rather than nurture. Virginia, the youngest, would later paint her childhood in shadows and venom. In her telling, Lois was a soul-devouring creature, a maternal black hole who consumed any light that dared to shine in their home. She spoke of emotional wastelands where parental love should have bloomed, of abandonment in all but the physical sense. But truth in the McCallow household was as fractured as their family dynamics. Her siblings would vehemently deny these claims, branding their youngest sister a manipulator of memories, a weaver of dark fantasies. The reality, perhaps, lay somewhere in the tangled space between these conflicting narratives. While her siblings fled to build their own lives, Virginia remained tethered to the family home well into her 30s. To her aging parents, she was a blessing, a dedicated daughter who shouldered the burden of their care. But beneath this facade of filial duty lurked something more complex. Her brief stint as a bartender gave way to complete dependence on her parents, her world shrinking to match theirs. Isolation became her constant companion. Without friends, hobbies, or meaningful connections, Virginia existed in a vacuum of her own making. Her siblings, weary of what they termed her pathological lying, maintained their distance, leaving her alone in that house with two aging parents who were slowly disappearing from public view. What no one realized was that this arrangement, a reclusive daughter caring for increasingly invisible parents, was about to reveal its true, horrifying nature. 2018 marked Virginia McCallow's 30th year, a milestone that found her still nestled in her parents' three-story house on Pump Hill Road in Chelmsford. The bustling neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the increasingly isolated world within those walls, where John and Lois McCallow, both well into their 70s, were slowly retreating from life's periphery. Time had not been kind to the elderly couple. John's body had become a battlefield of ailments, type 2 diabetes waging war alongside high blood pressure and cholesterol, each skirmish requiring its own regimen of medications. Lois's anxiety, that lifelong companion, had grown more demanding with age, requiring ever stronger chemical leashes to keep it at bay. In their medicated haze, they saw their youngest daughter as their salvation, a sacrificial angel who had laid her own life upon the altar of filial duty. But behind this facade of devotion, Virginia was orchestrating an elaborate performance of deception. Each morning, she would dress for a non-existent office job, carrying a briefcase filled with nothing but props for her daily charade. When she lost these imaginary positions, she crafted elaborate tales of workplace injustice, each story more intricate than the last. Her artistic aspirations became another act in this grand production. She painted mediocre landscapes and still lifes, weaving grandiose fantasies about prestigious art school credentials and eminent gallery exhibitions. To her aging parents, she spun golden dreams of future fortune, of paintings sold for princely sums, while others who saw her work could only offer polite, strained smiles. But Virginia's masterpiece of manipulation lay in her seizure of financial control. Playing upon her parents' technological ignorance and fear of the modern world, she positioned herself as their financial guardian. "Online banking is complicated," she would soothe. "Let me handle everything." John and Lois, their perception clouded by age and medication, handed over the keys to their kingdom, never suspecting they were empowering their own undoing. The irony was bitter. While they saw an angel of mercy, they had actually invited a predator into their nest. Virginia had transformed their trust into a weapon, wielding it with a precision that would have impressed even the most seasoned con artist. Each stolen dollar, each fabricated story, each manipulated moment was another thread in a web that would eventually entangle them all. Yet even as she drained their accounts, she maintained her performance of the devoted daughter, a role she had perfected to such a degree that her parents remained her most ardent defenders, blind to the monster wearing their daughter's face. Money has a way of revealing monsters. For Virginia, access to her parents' finances unleashed something ravenous within her, a spending addiction that devoured their savings with increasing voracity. Each swipe of their credit cards, each bank transfer became easier than the last, her guilt dissolving in the intoxicating rush of acquisition. She bought indiscriminately, compulsively, as if trying to fill some bottomless void within herself. The family's fractured dynamics created the perfect environment for her deception to flourish. Her siblings, living their separate lives, had settled into a comfortable delegation of duty. Virginia was there, so they didn't need to be. Their rare visits were perfunctory, brief check-ins that never scratched the surface of what was really happening in that house. The grandchildren's occasional presence served as a smokescreen of normalcy, their innocent love for their grandparents masking the rot spreading beneath the family's foundation. In this vacuum of oversight, Virginia's manipulations grew more elaborate. She began crafting an intricate tapestry of imagined illnesses, mysterious headaches that struck with storms, fabricated cysts requiring urgent and expensive treatments. But her masterpiece of deception was the false pregnancy, complete with a prosthetic belly and a tragic story of loss. Each manufactured malady was another strand in her web of control, another drain on her parents' dwindling resources. The psychology behind these fabrications painted a portrait of a woman desperate for attention, yet the attention she craved seemed to feed something darker within her. Each sympathetic glance, each concerned inquiry became currency in her emotional economy. She wielded her parents' concern like a master manipulator, transforming their worry into a weapon that further enabled her financial exploitation. Meanwhile, the debt mounted silently like snow on a roof before a collapse. Tens of thousands of pounds in loans and credit card charges accumulated under her parents' names, a financial noose tightening around their necks without their knowledge. John and Lois, still viewing their youngest daughter through the rose-tinted glasses of parental love, remained blind to the financial abyss she was dragging them toward. What they saw as a daughter's dedication was actually a predator's patience. Virginia had created a perfect ecosystem for her deceptions, isolated victims, distant witnesses, and complete control over the flow of information. But like all carefully constructed facades, this one too would eventually begin to crack. By early 2019, Virginia's web of deception had grown into a labyrinth from which even she was struggling to find her way out. The digital roulette wheels of online casinos had become her nightly companions, each spin funded by another loan taken in her parents' names. But the house of cards she'd built was beginning to tremble. When Lois and John first noticed their vanishing finances, Virginia didn't panic. She evolved. With the fluid creativity of a born manipulator, she spun an elaborate tale of cybercrime and faceless hackers. Her performance was masterful. The concerned daughter, equally victimized, fighting alongside her parents against invisible digital thieves. She painted herself as their protector in a world too modern and dangerous for them to navigate alone. Her deceptions grew more baroque with each passing week. She fabricated official-looking documents, even going so far as to impersonate a police officer investigating the supposed fraud. The attention to detail was chilling. She crafted elaborate apologetic letters about delays in the criminal investigation, each one calculated to buy her more time, more money, more control. Lois, in her innocence, documented it all in letters to her friend, unwittingly creating a paper trail of her own daughter's betrayal. "We've been victims of fraud," she wrote, never suspecting that the true fraudster sat across from her at the dinner table each night. These letters would later serve as a tragic testament to how completely Virginia had managed to deceive her own parents. But by March 2019, reality was closing in like walls in a horror movie. The loans were coming due, and Virginia's elaborate excuses were wearing thin. She found herself trapped in a spiral of her own making, unable to stop stealing, yet knowing each new theft brought her closer to exposure. The police she had impersonated would soon become all too real. The irony was savage. In trying to maintain her facade of the perfect daughter, Virginia had transformed into something monstrous. She was like a swimmer too far from shore, each desperate stroke to stay afloat only pulling her further into deeper, darker waters. As the walls closed in, a terrible question began to form in her mind. What would she do when there was nowhere left to hide? Evil sometimes arrives with the quietest of thoughts. For Virginia, it came as a solution, pristine in its simplicity, horrifying in its implications. The elimination of her parents emerged in her mind not as a violent flash, but as a cold calculation. Their deaths would solve everything: the mounting debts, the endless lies, the daily performance of being the devoted daughter. In her twisted arithmetic, 2 lives seemed a small price for her freedom. The idea, once planted, grew like a poisonous vine in her mind. Between March and June 2019, it transformed from abstract thought to methodical plan. Virginia approached murder with the same meticulous attention she'd given to her financial frauds. She began harvesting her parents' medications, building a private pharmacy of death. The sharp-bladed knife she purchased was backup, a silent partner in her contingency plans. Her preparatory phase was chilling in its clinical precision. She turned her parents into unwitting test subjects, carefully documenting their reactions to increased medication doses. Each meal became an experiment, each adverse reaction a data point in her lethal research. She watched them like a scientist observing lab rats, noting which combinations caused drowsiness, which sparked nausea, which might prove fatal in larger doses. June 17, 2019, arrived like any other summer evening. The setting sun painted the walls in warm hues as Virginia prepared her final act of filial betrayal. In her parents' drinks, she mixed her carefully calculated cocktail of death, crushed pills dissolving into John's customary nightcap and Lois's non-alcoholic beverage. The moment held a terrible intimacy, a daughter serving her parents their last drinks, watching with predators' patience as they raised the glasses to their lips. John, creature of habit, drained his glass without hesitation. But Lois, perhaps guided by some primitive survival instinct, took only a few sips before setting her glass aside. Virginia's persuasion, usually so effective, failed to convince her mother to finish the drink. In desperation, she left the glass by her mother's bedside, like a spider leaving poison for an unwary fly. The next morning arrived with the heavy stillness of tragedy. Virginia moved through the house with calculated casualness, first checking her father's room. John lay motionless in his bed, his chest still, his skin cooling. Her first success in this terrible experiment, but this was only half of her plan. And somewhere in the house, Lois still breathed. Death rarely follows a perfect plan. Virginia discovered this truth on that fateful morning as she found John's lifeless body. Her first success, but Lois still clinging to life. The bitterness of the medications, more pronounced in her mother's non-alcoholic drink, had saved her from an immediate death, though it left her in a twilight state of confusion and delirium. The sight of her mother's survival triggered something primal in Virginia, a mixture of panic and cold calculation. The radio's gentle music filled the room as she retrieved the hammer, a backup plan she'd hoped never to use. Standing in her mother's doorway, Virginia confronted a moment of terrible clarity. Lois lay there, vulnerable and innocent, the music washing over her like a final lullaby. For a heartbeat, humanity flickered in Virginia's soul, a daughter's love fighting against the monster she'd become. But monsters rarely retreat once unleashed. The hammer fell, a singular blow that should have ended everything. Instead, it created something worse. A moment of perfect horror as mother and daughter locked eyes, Lois's confused gaze meeting Virginia's desperate one. "What are you doing?" 4 words that shattered the clinical distance Virginia had tried to maintain from her actions. The next moments unfolded in a grotesque ballet of violence. When the hammer proved insufficient, Virginia turned to her knife, each strike fueled by a twisted cocktail of childhood resentment and present desperation. 8 wounds, yet still Lois fought for life, a mother's instinct to survive proving stronger than her daughter's determination to kill. The hammer's return marked Virginia's descent into pure frenzy. The wet sounds of impact mixed with the radio's cheerful tunes in a macabre symphony. Only when silence finally fell did Virginia's humanity seemingly return, a cruel parody of daughterly devotion as she kissed her mother's hand and whispered apologies to cooling flesh. She held those fingers until the last warmth fled, as if trying to comfort the very life she had just violently stolen. The morning's early light found Virginia in town, shopping for burial materials with the same practical efficiency she'd shown in planning the murders. Her explanation for the knife's use, that she didn't want mother to suffer, stood as perhaps her final act of self-deception, a desperate attempt to paint mercy onto an act of pure savagery. The hardware store clerk didn't bat an eye as she loaded 40 concrete blocks into her cart, along with bags of sand, cement mixture, and thick work gloves. The mundane nature of her shopping list belied its sinister purpose. Later that afternoon, she sat in her family doctor's office, wincing as he cleaned the wound she'd sustained during Lois's final moments. "Just a silly accident while chopping vegetables," she explained, her practiced smile never reaching her eyes. The day's errands continued with a sort of twisted celebration. Virginia called the bank for a new credit card, then treated herself to an extravagant shopping spree, designer clothes and glittering jewelry as rewards for her meticulous planning. That evening, her fingers hovered over her phone before composing a careful text to her sister, impersonating their mother. "John and I are taking a spontaneous beach vacation. Need some time away." A perfect excuse to keep her siblings at bay. 2 days after the unthinkable, Virginia faced her next challenge. Her parents' bodies still lay in their bedrooms, a constant reminder that forced her to confront the next phase of her plan. The neighborhood's quiet observation made moving the bodies too risky. Instead, a macabre solution took shape. She would transform their family home into a tomb. With methodical precision, she encased her father's body in a pre-purchased sleeping bag, wrapping it in exactly 11 layers of plastic film. The study, his favorite room, became his final resting place. She constructed a makeshift mausoleum from concrete blocks, securing each layer with cement mortar and filling every crack with expanding foam. It was almost reverential in its way. Her mother's fate reflected Virginia's lingering rage. She unceremoniously stuffed Lois's body into an upstairs closet, the sleeping bag barely containing her remains. Packing tape sealed the edges before concrete blocks rose to form an impromptu wall, erasing any trace of the space behind. The contrast in their final resting places spoke volumes about Virginia's complicated relationships with her parents. Her father's tomb had an almost ritualistic quality, while her mother's disposal carried the weight of years of unspoken resentment. The hammer blows and knife wounds that ended Lois's life had been driven by a fury that still echoed in the crude wall that now concealed her. Most chilling was Virginia's seamless return to normalcy. She moved through her days like any other resident, shopping at local stores, exchanging pleasant greetings with neighbors, maintaining her routine. Each night, she returned to the house-turned-crypt, eating dinner and watching television mere feet from where her parents lay entombed. She slept soundly in rooms that held such darkness, as if the concrete walls could contain not just bodies, but also guilt. The financial benefits started flowing immediately. Virginia collected their pension checks, opened credit cards in their names, and systematically drained their accounts. Money, her singular motivation, continued to fuel her elaborate deception. For months, life went on in this grotesque fashion, her parents' absence somehow going unnoticed in their small community. But questions eventually began to surface among the neighbors, like cracks in her carefully constructed facade. The facade began to crack like paint, peeling from old walls. Neighbors whispered about the McCallow's house, always shuttered, curtains drawn tight against prying eyes, windows sealed as if preserving secrets within. Virginia's behavior raised eyebrows too. Her explanations for her parents' absence evolved like a constantly shifting story. A vacation here, an illness there, each tale more elaborate than the last. But lying to neighbors was simple compared to deceiving family. Virginia orchestrated an intricate dance of deception through Lois's phone, crafting messages to her siblings with calculating precision. She mimicked her mother's writing style, asking about grandchildren and daily life while masterfully deflecting any possibility of visits. Her excuses formed a protective barrier. Illness, poor timing, unexpected travel, each one another brick in her wall of lies. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how readily her siblings accepted these digital ghosts of their parents. Their unquestioning belief spoke volumes about the McCallow family dynamics, relationships grown cold long before death froze them permanently. The older siblings had never been frequent visitors, accepting their parents' apparent desire for distance with practiced indifference. As 2019 melted into 2020, John and Lois's absence remained unremarkable in their children's lives. Then came an unexpected ally in Virginia's deception, the global pandemic. Lockdowns and isolation became her shield. The world's retreat behind closed doors normalized her parents' supposed seclusion. No one questioned why the elderly couple never emerged. Everyone was hiding away. Even after restrictions lifted and the world stumbled back toward normalcy, Virginia's macabre charade continued undetected. For 2 years, she maintained her performance with chilling attention to detail. Birthday cards arrived on schedule, Christmas greetings maintained familial facades, and both John and Lois kept up appearances through carefully orchestrated interactions with local services. Virginia's commitment to the illusion bordered on obsessive. She scheduled and canceled medical appointments with practiced excuses. More bizarrely, she adopted her mother's identity to file police complaints about neighborhood disturbances, 238 calls between July 2020 and September 2023. Each call served a dual purpose, maintaining the illusion of her parents' existence while establishing a paper trail of their supposed activities. Behind each action lay calculated purpose, a daughter living among the entombed remains of her parents while meticulously crafting the illusion of their continued existence. The concrete walls she'd built contained not just bodies, but a complex web of deception that grew more elaborate with each passing day. Some would later theorize that Virginia's increasingly erratic behavior was a subconscious cry for discovery. Her compulsive calls to police seemed less like maintenance of her deception and more like a twisted game of chicken. How close could she dance to exposure before the truth emerged from behind those concrete walls? The house's oppressive atmosphere began taking its toll. Hours would pass as she swept the same patch of yard, her movements mechanical and repetitive as if trying to brush away invisible stains. The knowledge of what lay within those walls seemed to push her outdoors into an increasingly desperate search for human connection. Her hunger for interaction became insatiable. Shop assistants, delivery drivers, postal workers, anyone who crossed her path became an unwitting audience for her performances. She'd corner them with rapid-fire conversation, always circling back to her parents like a moth to flame. One moment, she'd spin tales of their idyllic coastal retirement. The next, she'd drop dark hints about police suspicions and parental executions, as if testing the waters of confession. The community's perception of Virginia shifted gradually. The quiet daughter transformed into the neighborhood eccentric, known for her strange generosity, random gifts appearing on doorsteps like offerings to appease unseen gods. Bottles of wine, trinkets, flowers, and sweets materialized unprompted. Her next-door neighbor regularly found boxes of donuts and Chinese takeout at his doorstep, each delivery a silent plea for connection or perhaps absolution. Then came the return of an old deception, elevated to new heights of desperation. Virginia strapped on a prosthetic belly, draped herself in maternity wear, and crafted an elaborate pregnancy narrative complete with ultrasound images harvested from the internet, all while maintaining her complex web of lies about John and Lois, weaving cheerful tales of family dinners that never happened in a house that had become a tomb. 4 years of living alongside her brutal handiwork had transformed Virginia. By August 2023, paranoia had sunk its claws deep into her psyche. She spun tales of sabotaged doorbells and damaged internet connections, convinced unseen forces were monitoring her every move. The woman who had once executed such a calculated plan now unraveled in slow motion, performing her deteriorating mental state for anyone who would watch. Behind her increasingly bizarre behavior lay a terrible irony. The seemingly harmless eccentric who brought gifts and sought friendship harbored one of the darkest secrets imaginable. While neighbors dismissed her strange ramblings, the concrete walls of her home stood silent sentinel over the evidence of her true nature, waiting for the inevitable moment when her carefully constructed world would finally collapse. Summer 2023 marked Virginia's steepest descent into self-destructive behavior. Her calls to police became almost compulsive, each fabricated crisis more elaborate than the last. The pinnacle came when she reported an imaginary assault scratching her own face to lend credibility to her tale. Officers sat in her living room taking statements, mere feet from John's concrete tomb, while Virginia performed her role of victim, perhaps testing how close she could dance to discovery without the walls crumbling. But fate often turns on small details. In August, a vigilant clinic receptionist noticed a disturbing pattern in the McCallow's medical records. 4 years of methodically scheduled, then canceled appointments, a red flag that couldn't be ignored, especially given the couple's documented health issues. The methodical scheduling and cancellation of appointments had created an unintentional paper trail of absence. On September 1st, 2023, the family physician broke the chain of silence. His concern for his longtime patients prompted a call to local law enforcement, a pebble that would trigger an avalanche. Virginia, confronted by police inquiries, spun one final tale. Her parents were away, unreachable by choice, due to return by October's end. Each word added another strand to the web of lies she'd been weaving for years. The police's initial patience quickly gave way to suspicion. When the promised return date passed without sign of the elderly couple, the authorities' concern crystallized into action. On September 15, 2023, armed with a search warrant, they orchestrated a tactical approach to the McCallow residence. The final act unfolded like a carefully choreographed drama. One team of officers approached the front door, their knocks echoing through the house like judgment itself. Simultaneously, a second unit moved with swift precision toward the rear entrance. The shattering of the back door's glass panel pierced the morning air, a sound that marked the end of Virginia's 4-year performance. Behind those walls, the secrets she'd so carefully entombed were about to emerge into the light of day. When the officers burst in with their accusations, Virginia's reaction was unnervingly serene. As if she'd been waiting in the wings for this exact moment, her role in this macabre play finally reaching its finale. The handcuffs clicked around her wrist like a costume change, and she offered almost eagerly to guide them through her house of horrors. The tour she led was chillingly matter-of-fact. In her father's study, she gestured toward a concrete monolith draped in blankets, decorated with her own artwork, a grotesque gallery atop his makeshift mausoleum. Her voice remained steady, even playful, as she revealed her father's final resting place. The revelation about her mother came as casually as directing someone to a coat closet upstairs. Without prompting, Virginia launched into her confession, the words spilling out like she'd rehearsed them countless times. She spoke of pills and violence with clinical detachment, pausing only to muse about the state of her mother's remains after 4 years of entombment. The officers maintained their professional masks, but their eyes betrayed their horror at her casual recounting of patricide and matricide. When presented with her confession to sign, Virginia's response was almost theatrical. "You should celebrate. You've caught a bad person today." A pause, then an afterthought tinged with artificial contemplation. "I suppose I really do deserve punishment." Her performance wavered between self-awareness and dissociation, as if she couldn't quite decide which role to play. The grim validation of her story came when investigators located exactly what she'd described. Time had reduced John and Lois to little more than skeleton fragments, their final identification requiring dental records. Yet even behind bars, Virginia couldn't maintain silence. She continued her monologue to anyone within earshot, offering gruesome details like party favors. In one final act of manipulation, she attempted to manufacture grief, wiping at non-existent tears. When her performance failed to elicit the desired sympathy, she abandoned the pretense as easily as changing channels. Her final revelation came without emotion. The murder weapon, a hammer still bearing traces of Lois's blood, lay waiting in a box beneath the stairs like some twisted time capsule of her crimes. The case of Virginia McCallow's stands as a chilling testament to how ordinary houses can hide extraordinary horrors, and how the facade of normalcy can mask the darkest of human capabilities. The evidence lay in plain sight all along, the rusted hammer still bearing silent witness to its role in the crime, while the knife that ended Lois's life rested innocuously among kitchen utensils. For John and Lois's other children, the revelation came like a bolt from clear sky. The discovery that their parents had been dead for years while they believed them to be living hermits shattered their understanding of reality. The siblings found themselves reconstructing memories with horrible new context. Those peculiar phone calls where their mother's voice sounded off, explained away by phantom sore throats, had been their sister's masterful mimicry. Every text message, every canceled plan, every holiday card had been part of Virginia's elaborate performance. The realization that they'd been unwitting actors in her macabre play haunted them most of all. Their grief came layered with guilt and anger, not just for the loss of their parents, but for the theft of their goodbyes. Virginia had robbed them twice, first of their parents' lives, then of their chance to mourn properly. The weight of 4 years of unknowing pressed heavy on their consciousness, each memory of missed opportunities to discover the truth adding to their burden. When Virginia McCallow appeared for sentencing on Friday, October 11, 2024, her guilty plea had already foreclosed any chance of understanding the full scope of her actions. The bare facts spoke clearly enough. $200,000 stolen, 2 lives ended, 4 years of deception. Yet the deeper psychological mysteries of how a daughter could live so long with her horrific actions remained locked behind Virginia's inscrutable facade. The judge's sentence attempted to balance justice with recognition of Virginia's documented mental health issues, the personality disorder, depression, and post-homicide psychosis that had emerged like dark flowers from the soil of her crimes. Life imprisonment with a minimum of 36 years seemed both massive and insufficient, a time span that would see Virginia emerge into her 8th decade, should she live that long. There was a dark poetry to the timing. She would become eligible for parole at roughly the age her parents were when she decided they had lived long enough. The symmetry felt like one final manipulation from a woman who had orchestrated every detail of her gruesome performance, right up to its inevitable final act.